The lecture today, the presentation today deals with the issue of rights and tenure in fisheries targeting seabed resources. Seabed resources meaning everything that is attached to the seabed. Invertebrates, our mariscos or shellfish, but also algae, corals, sponges, everything that is attached to the seabed. And we are going to review several cases from Latin America and try to derive some general lessons from comparison, and basically is learning from experience. What have we learned from a number of cases we have been involved with? The presentation today is part of the results of a project on tenure in Latin American fisheries. Has two components: one on shellfish or benthic resources, and the other on finfish resources. I coordinated the benthic stuff, and my colleague Juan Carlos Seijo from Yucatan, Mexico, from Merida, he coordinated the counterpart, the finfish study cases. And this is part of a project from FAO called Guidelines on the Responsible Governance of Tenure of Land, Fisheries, and Forests, and is oriented ultimately to develop some code of conduct for the governance of those resources. And of course, our work is support for the fisheries component. The focus of this presentation is on incentives. And you know that there is over the recent years, there has been a lot of emphasis on the significance of incentives for sustainable and resilient management of world capture fisheries. And in the case, in the understanding that the aligning the right incentives is fundamental for sustainability and for motivate the responsible behavior of the fishers and other stakeholders and actors of the system as well. So in the particular case of fishers, which we are interested in this case, those incentives usually take the form of tenure or access, rights, or privileges. And we are going to make here a small distinction. In much of the literature, those two words, rights and privileges, are used interchangeably. But we make a distinction in the sense that rights are fundamental. It's something that cannot be alienated from somebody, while privileges are alienable and is something that is conferred or granted by society under special circumstances. So there's a difference in the strength of the ownership quotation mark. Now, in the case of industrial fisheries that we tend to be familiar with, and it's the fisheries that basically on which the theory of fishery was built upon. Those privileges usually take the form of ITQs or something related to that. ITQs meaning individual transferable quotas. Everybody knows what that means, either from the press or from, in these days it's a well-known, well-understood concept. Well, not understood, but well-known. And then there's a number of other, like individual vessel quotas and other individual quotas, and they can be transferable or non-transferable. So there is a whole family of arrangements. Now, all those systems, ITQs and related systems, they have several characteristics. They are administratively expensive in the implementation. They are demanding in terms of the stock assessment support that they require. And they require effective enforcement. All those things are very difficult to achieve in the case of small-scale fisheries. You can, in principle, think that they can, feasible in large industrial fisheries, but in the case of the small-scale fisheries spread in small villages along thousands of kilometers of coasts, it's a difficult proposition. So. Besides that, many of those systems like ITQs and so on, when they are implemented in small-scale fisheries, they tend to be, and they have been in many occasions, highly disruptive. When because when you implement one of those systems, somebody is left inside, somebody is left outside, somebody will wake up in the morning with a lot of asset in his pocket because he got a quota, and somebody will be left empty-handed. And in the socially tightly knit communities we tend to work with, this can be really disruptive. So in the case of small-scale fisheries, we need to consider a wider range of options for the allocation of access, privileges, and rights. That means for creating the incentives for the behavior that society expects from the fishers. And this is particularly the case in what we call the S-fisheries. Now, what are the S-fisheries? Anna coined the term S-fishery for a family of fisheries that is very well characterized. And the name S-fishery comes from the numbers of times that the letter S appears in the diagnostic characteristics of it, so there's nothing magical about that. It's just convenient to have a shorthand, an easy term. So they tend to be small scale. They are all small scale, not tend to be. They are spatially structured. They target generally sedentary stocks because animals attached to the seabed. They are either sessile, like mussels and sponges and algae, or if they move, they don't move a lot in relative terms, as, for example, as related to the fishing process. That's the case of octopus and crab and lobsters and the like. And then they tend to target single species or a few species. So the S-fisheries are, as I was saying before, they are a very well-defined category, and that's strong. They have that strong spatial structure unfolds across a hierarchy of nested scales. And that hierarchy is the scaffolding of all the components of the social ecological systems of which these S-fisheries are part, in the dynamics and the structure of the resources, because these sedentary resources tend to have a lot of structure, and that structure is persistent in time. You tend to find a mussel bed where it has been in the past. That structure of the resource, it will give structure to the fishing process itself, so that the fishing process, for example, the pattern of effort allocation, effort intensity matches the distribution of the resource, to the geography of the fishing communities and social networks, because fishing communities in places like Chile or that we know well, the fishermen community tend to be located close to the fishing grounds, to the harvest strategies, and ultimately to the governance institutions. Now, the significance of that spatial dimension in the case of S-fisheries means that there is it opens the possibility of a high diversity of tenure arrangements. And why is that? The reason for that is that in this fishery you have an opportunity that you don't have in other fisheries, which is access or privileges that are based on territory, not on a quota, on an effort quota, on a catch quota, but on some form of territorial allocation. And there are many forms of territorial allocation, formal or informal, and that gives a lot of, it's a very rich system in terms of. So one more thing that I wanted to mention, I mentioned before that they tend to target either single species or a few species. And S-fisheries, at least the ones we deal with, are sharply contrasting with the stereotype that everybody has in mind when you mention small-scale fisheries. You say small-scale fisheries and people will think in tropical, multi-species, and subsistence. And that's not the case in the fisheries we deal with, S-fisheries. Fishermen tend to target very specifically some resources. And those resources, in most cases, or in virtually all cases that we are looking into, are highly valuable, and they tend to be consumed by either affluent consumers, and they even fuel significant export industries. So the fishery can be small scale, but many times the industry that they fuel, like the in the sea urchin fishery in southern Chile that we are going to mention, can be a significant industry. So it's very different from the tropical subsistence multi-species stereotype. Approximately 30 other people that are familiar with particular systems, and we put together a comparative study with cases going from Northwest Mexico to Patagonia, including the co-ops of Northwest Mexico, the co-ops of lobster fishermen in Yucatan, the Galapagos Island sea cucumber fishery, the Afro-Colombian communities of the Pacific side of Colombia, the Pepitona fishery in Sucre State in Venezuela, the Caranguejo Usá fisheries in the mangrove swamps of northeast Brazil, and so on, the implementation of territorial rights in small-scale fishing communities of Chile, the southern Chile sea urchin fishery. Only one industrial fishery we consider is a scallop fishery offshore of Argentina. And then small-scale, some tiny fisheries in Patagonia, Uruguay, and southern Brazil. So in total, something like 20-something different fisheries or systems. Now, through the presentation, I'm going to hinge around the issue that the diversity of tenure systems can be categorized on the basis of three main families of attributes. The first one is what is that is allocated to the fishers. And the thing that is allocated can be licenses, fishing licenses, can be catch or effort quotas, can be territorial use privileges, or can be user rights that are not granted. You know, they are fundamental. And the second axis is whom are the access privileges or rights vested on, and we have a number of alternatives. They can be vested on individuals, for example, individual fishers or coastal gatherers. They can be vested on the fishing units, for example, the boats or fishing vessels, large or small, on fishermen organizations like associations or co-ops, or on communities, which is the case usually the case of fishing rights, and we'll come back to that later. And the third axis, finally, which is very important, is the spatial scale of the privileges or rights that are being vested, that are being granted. So we are going to present some examples from Latin America. And these are the basic families of systems that we are going to deal with. The first one, the default, really, in our countries, is an open access fishery. All these fisheries started as open access at some point. And many of them are still open access, either because nobody cares or just because of lack of effective enforcement or regulation. So we have only one case that I'm going to mention. Then we have the next thing, you know, when you have a problem with overfishing, with a open access fishery, the first thing that governments will do is introduce a moratorium on the number of boats, the number of fishermen, the number of something, so freeze the system. And these moratoria are usually associated or combined with a TAC, a total allowable catch. And the moratoria can be, as I was saying, a moratorium on individuals and boats or whatever. The next category is the catch shares. When you have a pie, there is so much to, there is a quota, and I partition the quota, and it's so much for him, and so much for him, and so much for him, for this boat or that fish, and so on. This is catch shares. And ITQs are a form of catch shares. There are many others. There's a wide variety of... the next one is the territorial use privileges, and we are going to consider two different families. One is the, and I'll come back to that later. And the last one is the territorial use rights held by communities of users. Now, our first case, the open. Do you see the pictures? More or less, sort of. Okay. Our best example is the Pepitona fishery in Sucre State in Venezuela. And this is actually one of the largest clam fisheries in the world, or has been, because it's declining very fast. So we can foresee in the near future that at some point they will introduce some sort of moratoria. And that's going to come on the boats, on the fish. But the debate these days is very complicated because of the political climate that they are going through in Venezuela. But something is going to happen because the fishery is going down the sink. It's amazing that it survived for many, many years with very high catches and absolutely unregulated. So it's an epibenthic clam. It's a clam that lives like a mussel on top of the substrate. They form great aggregates, and it's a very bizarre fishery. I don't know if you can appreciate. These are the boats, fishing boats about 15 meters long. They fish at night because it's so hot during the day that they cannot operate there. And they bring the catch unsorted in big bags. And that's what it shows here. You see a truck there and some black smoke going on. And what they do is they bring the catch unsorted, you know, the Pepitona and all the associated fauna and mud and whatever, you name it, most of it, in big bags, and they soak those in huge containers of boiling water that are heated with tires and crude oil and used oil from vehicles. So between the fumes of this boiling thing and the fumes of the burning tires is like an inferno, that thing. And then they take this boiled and sorted catch to the fishermen houses, and they peel off the clams there, and from there on they go, you know, the meats go to canning plants, and the canning plants are perfect, are 20th century, you know. But the previous process is very intriguing. I've never seen something like that, and it's a huge industry. And those canned pepitonas are one of the most popular food staples in Venezuela for cocktails and that kind of stuff. So we see a very primitive fishery fueling a significant, very significant industry. So now, this is a fishery, sea urchin in southern Chile, that at one point many people feared was approaching a Pepitona kind of situation. You know, there were symptoms in the size of the sea urchins, in the landing, whatever. By the late 1990s, they thought that the fishery was going, and then the government reacted and tried several ways of regulating the fishery. In 2001, there were some violent confrontations between fishers of two adjacent regions. The region where this fishery operates is huge. This is 4 degrees of latitude. So, and especially this part is inhospitable, is remote, and they operate in a very particular, you know, the tender boats will pull small boats to remote locations where people stay in what they call plastic calitas, because are huts constructed with plastic and cardboard and so on, very precarious. And they live there through the fishing season, which is winter time. And you know, this is 43 south in the southern hemisphere. Is cold and windy and miserable. And the tender boats will go every 2 or 3 days to those fishing camps and take the sea urchin, take it to the plants which are located there, and will sail back with food and water and supplies, and oil and supplies for the small fishing boats. You see one of them here. They're about 12, 13 meters. Now, this industry again, this fishery, involves something like 6,000 divers and produces about supplies about 80% of the world supplies of sea urchin roe that goes almost exclusively to Japan. So again, we see a case of, you know, the boats are small, the fishermen are poor, they live miserable lives, but they fuel a huge, significant industry. So this is not your typical small scale. They are different. And this is this picture here is that speck. It's a place where there is a plastic calita there, and these are radio tracking like Maria and two with Maria did with with data loggers are all the tracks of individual boats to the fishing grounds to and from this plastic calita. In following the crisis of 2001, where there were some significant battles, Anna and myself and a colleague of us, Lou Bosfor, whom some of you from the US may know, we got caught in the middle of a battle between fishermen and the police. And there was a participative process created, implemented, and there is a sense of order in the fishery. Not that everything is perfect. There are many problems, and many of the problems stems that the licenses, the permits, are there's no allocation of the quota here. So it's not a catch share system, but the licenses or the rights, the access rights, are vested on the individuals, not on the boats. And that's a big problem in this fishery, because the individuals are a very dynamic population. Fishermen will come and go, they will age, die, and while boats are more, they have a more stable dynamics. So in all these systems, when you have the privileges vested on the individuals, you have, especially if there are many individuals, like in this case where you have 6,000 divers, it's a real problem, because you need a registry, you need to keep track of individuals, whether they are in the fishery or they are out of the fishery or died, or so it's a complete mess. So that's the most difficult. But for a number of reasons, it's difficult for them to revert from individual licenses to boat licenses. But it's one of the significant issues there. Now we go now into the catch shares, and this is the fishery we are most familiar with, that Anna does a lot of work these days with. This is San Jose Gulf. This is about 80 kilometers southern Patagonia. Luis, you were there, and Antonio too, visiting there. And it's a commercial diving fishery with a hookah system, with a compressor on the boat, basically the same gear that they use here in the sea urchin fishery in Galicia. And small boats, about 10 meters long, pulled by a tractor on the beach. That's the whole fishing unit. The fishery also went through a crisis. In the late 90s, the fishery grew unregulated. During the 80s, the 1980s, and suddenly one day they found that there were no more scallops. They fished scallops, I forgot to say that. There were no more scallops. And so they closed the fishery for 3 years, with all the suffering that you can imagine. For it's not a big community. It's probably 100 and something fishermen involved in that fishery. But for Patagonia, which doesn't have much population, it's a significant local regional activity. So back in 2001, when we went back to Argentina from the US, they asked us what to do, give us a number. We need a quota. We told them we cannot give you a quota. Well, we have to sit all together, fishermen, administrators, ourselves around the table and discuss, and so we did. And we have had some significant participatory process with its ups and downs over the years, but it has been an orderly fishery for more than 10 years and productive. There's 21 teams, and there is a quota. Every year there is a survey. These are all diving transects around San Jose Gulf, and the survey is conducted jointly between scientists from our center and then under the aegis of Anna and fishermen from the local association of artisanal fishers. And from that survey there is a quota, and the quota is divided in equal parts, catch shares, between the 21. In this case, the permits are vested on the boats, not on the individuals, which makes the system more manageable than the case of southern Chile that I just mentioned. So the fishery is now is in one of the downturns I would say, mostly because the main problem that we have been facing recently is the lack of political will from the provincial authority in terms of the enforcement that you require, that is needed to as one of the components of any of these systems. They are the most difficult member in the participatory process. Working with the fishermen is much easier than working with the administration. So, and this catch share system, they can be large or small. And we have here the two extremes. This is the fishery, the only industrial fishery that was mentioned earlier. This is the scallop fishery of Argentina. These are the fishing grounds aligned there at about 100-meter depth. You have 4 vessels, large vessels with twin trawls, twin otter trawls. They are processing. They fish. There are 2 American vessels, 2 Canadian. They work year-round, 365 days a year, around the clock, day and night, fish and fish and fish. And it's one of the largest scallop fisheries in the world. They landed up to 90,000 tons in a single year. It's certified by the Marine Stewardship Council. It was the first scallop fishery certified in the world, and the first industrial fishery in a developing country to get certification. And we tend to think that, if anything, this fishery is a interesting study case because it shows, in our opinion, the limitations of the certification process in a developing country, because we have serious doubts about this fishery having the merit to be certified for a number of problems. That is not the case. That I wouldn't be. This is not the place to discuss. Now, on the other end, we have nearby the scallop fishery that I mentioned before, the small-scale scallop fishery in San Jose Gulf. Here, in one corner of San Jose Gulf, there's a tiny village, 20 houses, 15 families approximately, and 4 or 5 loners. And Inés has been there in El Riacho, and they gather mussels in the intertidal zone using these Mad Max style vehicles to run over the mud flats and sand flats and bring back the mussels to the village and sell them to buyers. Now, in this case, they estimate a quota again, like in the other fishery, like in the huge large-scale fishery, and they divide it into 15 pies, equal. So it's a catch share and a catch share system, small one, but and then we go into the territorial access privileges. In the previous case, they were allocating a part of the quota, so it was catch allocation. Here is a territorial allocation. And we have 2 big families, as I mentioned before, of territorial allocation. In one of them, this is the community, and each dot there represents a person or a member of the community. And in one case, the community gets a privilege of access to a parcel, a tract of the seabed, a piece of the seabed. So the members of the community, usually it's a fisher organization, not the community. You can consider that a community, but when you say community, you tend to think about family members and so on. So to an organization, let's be more precise. So they grant access rights to an organization. In the case of Chile, for example, it's an association. In Mexico are co-ops. And they can fish within some species within that tract of seabed. In the other case, individual members of the community, in the other family of cases, have access privileges to fishing spots. And this is more typical of interception gear, things like traps, gill nets, casitas, as we are going to see in the case of Mexico. So individual fishing spots that do not need to be adjacent. And the privileges are vested on individuals, not on the organization. So it's both are territorial, but they are distinctive. And the examples that we have here one is very well known in the international literature because there has been a lot written about it, is the territorial rights systems in Mexico, where the government granted to fishing communities called calitas in Chile access to small tracts of seabed where they can harvest basically shellfish and mostly loco. Loco is a highly valued abalone looking, it's not an abalone, but looks sort of an abalone a snail that is exported to the Far East, to Hong Kong and China, Japan and Korea and so on. And the second case are the co-ops of Baja California in Mexico. And the third case we are going to, I think those are the, yeah, we have two cases we are going to consider only one case in Baja California. Now, there's some cases, some particular cases that I'm not going to discuss, where these territorial access privileges can be vested on individuals or in commercial firms. Commercial firms is the case of in Argentine Patagonia. In the case of the algae, there are companies that get access rights to stretches of the seashore. And in Mexico, in the recent, there's a recent change in the regulation through which those, what they call predios of aprovechamiento or polígonos, which are tracts of seabed, can be granted to individuals, although most of them are still in the hands of co-ops. Now, scale matters a lot in these systems, and this is a Chilean case, and this is the Baja California case in Mexico. Now, you see, this is probably one kilometer, and this is the area of Concepcion in Chile, and the AMERs, those territorial allocations, are these tiny polygons that you see there. You see there? And this is a size frequency distribution or an extension distribution of those AMERs or turfs, territorial use rights in fisheries, as they are called in technical literature, in all of Mexico. The average size of a turf is between 100 and 200 hectares, so they are very small. Now, this creates a very interesting situation, because fishermen may be very conservative about resources within their AMER, within their turf, their small territorial grant. But they behave in just the opposite ways in the open fishing grounds, where loco is nominally cannot be harvested, but is harvested because who is going to police 36 degrees of latitude of coastline from the border of Peru to Cape Horn? It's impossible. It's an impossible proposal. So, in fact, you have a dual system where you have one thing going on within the AMERs and something very different going outside. So you have the resources reasonably well in many of the AMERs, and is heavily overexploited in the supposedly closed, open, in reality, open access grounds. Now, in the case of Mexico, the system is very different. You have these polygons are huge. You see here you have, again, 3 degrees of latitude. So there are 9 co-ops here. Each co-op has exclusive access rights to one of those polygons. The 9 co-ops are grouped into a federation, FEDECOOP, which is very powerful. It has a lot of political muscle and economical power. They target lobster, sea urchin, and abalone mostly. And the lobster fishery of FEDECOOP is the first small-scale fishery in the world to be certified by the Marine Stewardship Council. This system runs like a clock. One of the reasons is that the region is rather remote, and that there's no role for enforcement by the government. So who enforces? Well, people themselves. And it's Mexican style. Nobody will ever dream of stealing lobsters from those fishing grounds. So it's very effective enforcement, informal, but effective. and a continuous surface. There's no unallocated territory there. Everything is allocated to one of the co-ops. So let's look into these cases in a little bit more of detail. The case of Chile, the Chilean system, was introduced in the Chilean Fisheries Act back in 1993, and started to be implemented around 1998. And the introduction of territorial use rights was a last desperate reaction to a crisis in the local fishery. The fishery, there were symptoms of overfishing in what was a virtually open fishery, and the fishery was closed for 3 years. You see those 3 years there. That's between 1989 and 1993 approximately, month more, month less. And really, this shows no catch. Really, there was no legal catch because fishermen continue harvesting loco. The main effect of that draconian measure that was the 3-year closure was not that the fishing stopped, but that the fishermen were marginalized and left to operate in the black market instead of in a regular market. So following that disaster, they implemented a system of individual fishing rights, but the rights were vested on the individuals. There were too many individuals, same problem that we mentioned before when you vest rights on the individuals rather than something more stable like the boats. And the system went down the drain again. And finally, they implemented the territorial use rights and the AMER system, or the turf system of Chile, that is so well documented in the literature. So you see sprouting these signs all over the coast of Chile saying, no trespassing, no going in. This is exclusive access for this such and such a fisherman organization. And here you see an operation. Here they are landing. I don't know if you see that. That's a boat and a truck. An interesting change. There was an interesting change in the way of the product is marketed. They sell the loco while the loco is still in the water. And so they will go very orderly. They will fish only a few days during the season. And on a prearranged date, the truck will come to the beach. They will go catch the amount that they decided to sell, they agreed to sell, and then they will harvest that and take it to the truck. Now, they work all together. You never see in those AMERs fishermen fishing individually by themselves on a given day to catch, say, suppose that they have some share. No. And the reason they don't do that is that they do not trust each other, of course, because so nobody fishes in the AMER, and the vigilance is very strict. Nobody fishes by himself. They all fish together on predetermined days and take the catch and sell the catch all together. And so it's a very interesting turn over recent years in the way so it's a very interesting system. Still, it's a dual system with a lot of problems. Now, the other family is the family of that I was mentioning before, is the one of the fishing spots. And we have here 3 examples. 2 of them are lobster fisheries, and the third one is algal gatherers in Chile in the intertidal zone. So the 2 individual the 2 lobster fisheries are a fishery in Quintana Roo in Mexico, in the Mexican Caribbean, a region known as Punta Allen, which is located within a protected area. Is a heritage of the humanity, whatever. And the other one is the Juan Fernandez lobster fishery. Juan Fernandez are the mythical islands that inspired Robinson Crusoe, the Juan Fernandez Islands of central Chile. And usually these systems where you have individual fishing spots, they involve some form of customary marine rights. They are informal systems, because formally it would be almost impossible to say, well, this is yours, this is yours, this is yours, and a priori for the administration. So these are usually systems that evolve through history, through a complex history of adjustment social relationships between members of the community. And they are typically associated with interception gear, as I mentioned before. And they have, because they develop spontaneously within the community, and usually they evolve not as a form of achieve sustainability, a way of achieving sustainability, but usually as a way of achieving equitability in the distribution of the returns between the members of the community. So they have very complex rules for the transactions of those sites. So sites are usually often transferable, inheritable. It's a very complex, unwritten, informal rules, but complex. And there is a great risk in the case of these fisheries in trying to formalize them, because once you formalize a system that is based on adaptiveness and flexibility, you can put a straitjacket on the system and neutralize whatever is positive in it. Now, let's look at some pictorial representation. This is the Mexican Caribbean fishery. This is Asunción Bay, Punta Allen. And each of these polygons here, there's something like 100 and something of them, is called a campo. And in the Campos Langosteros, in each campo, they deploy a number of these structures on the bottom. I don't know if you see the diver there. One is holding the piece of cement, and the other is getting the lobsters underneath. So the lobsters will migrate from the bay to the offshore, and as they move through, they will seek refuge under those casitas, and that's where they get they are captured by the fishermen. Now, catches have gone up and down, rather stable. CPUE has been going up in recent years, mostly because there has been some attrition in the number of fishers, and they are reluctant in expanding the number of participating fishers. So they have very tight internal regulations within the community. Now, this is a sort of one of the boutique fisheries in Latin America. One of those, the 2 or 3 fisheries that work best in Latin America are those that have systems that evolve from informal rules that evolve with within the community, and this is one case. Now it's under review for certification by the Marine Stewardship Council, and it's likely to get certified during this or next year. And this is the natural reserve of Siancan, where the Asunción Bay is located. There are 3 bays, 3 co-ops, very well organized. This is the other case, Juan Fernandez Island, that gave origin to the myth of Robinson Crusoe. And these are the traps that they use, wooden made. These are the boats, sort of 2 pro-baleen boats. And catches have been going up and down. They are recovering. They are going up have been going up in recent years. And in this case, there is a system that went unnoticed for many years, which is called the marcas system. And marcas are spots where fishermen will deploy a trap, 1 trap per marca with 1 buoy, and usually rocky outcrops underwater. Our colleague Billy Ernst and the syndicate of fishermen from the island have been working together, trying to map all the marcas. 2 of our fishermen colleagues have been going on board with the GPS and trying to locate where the marcas are, because they know the marcas by alignments on the seashore, but there's no map of the marcas. So in that survey, they identify something like 3,000 and so many marcas. And fishermen know their marcas, and they know the marcas of others. Of course, there is a lot of squabbling. You are into my marca, I saw you. You are not. No, this is mine. But the system works. It's the same thing happens in every in academics about desk space and all that. So it's the same thing here. But the system works and has been working for many years. And what is unwritten, they have very complex regulations, rules for the transfer of marks. The marcas can go with the boat. You can sell the boat with the marcas or without the marcas, but you cannot sell the marca itself. So there's a number of, they can be inherited. So you have many women in town that have never been on a boat, but they own some marcas that are fished by their family members or somebody else. So very intricate system of arrangements that guarantee some level of social equity of access between members of the community, and which we think has contributed substantially to the sustainability of the fishery. So this is one of, and the third fishing spot systems is the algae in much of the Chilean coast. They have these piedras, or as they call them, parcelas, which are rocks. This is a handmade map of rocks made by a colleague with members of a community, and those rocks, access to those rocks can be decided every year through a lottery, for example, because some rocks are better than others, and so that you don't get every year the same productive rock. So we'll have a lottery every year, or some have owners, and it depends on each community. It's an incredible diversity of arrangements for the ownership and access privileges to those rocks. And they will cut the algae during the low tide. The algae gets stranded on the beach. They collect them, and then they pack them in a very distinctive way, very tidy packages that you see in markets all over the country. It's a very popular food staple. And now finally, the last family that we are going to touch on are those communal territorial use rights. And those are things that evolve in different places, more or less during the 90s, basically, under the political climate of the 90s, and the idea that many communities in Latin America and also in New Zealand and other parts of the world, in the US and different parts of the world, have been deprived of their fundamental rights during the recent centuries, with the expansion of the European population and so on. So during the 90s, there was a movement towards the restitution of fundamental rights to communities of indigenous peoples or traditional users. And the largest of these systems is what is called the RESEX system in Brazil. RESEX goes for Reservas Extrativistas. And the origin of those RESEX is in the Amazonia, with the seringueiros, the men who gather rubber in the forest. And there was a famous leader, Chico Mendes, who confronted the cattle rangers back in the 80s, and he was killed. But there was a great uproar after his assassination, and that in the end that led to the recognition of their traditional rights by the government and the creation of the figure of the RESEX. And now the other cases are the Chile has come recently with a figure called EMCO, for who some of the beneficiaries will be the Lafkenche Indians of southern Chile that will get access to significant resources in significant sectors of the seacoast, and the Afro-Colombian communities from the Pacific coast of Colombia, and another case, probably the first one to get this type of right allocation or right restitution, were the Seri Indian Reservation in Sonora in the Gulf of California. So essentially these are different from all other cases that we were dealing with before. Access rights involve a package that is much wider than fishery. They involve access to land resources and to many, and also they have a lot of, there is a lot of a significant devolution of authority. Those communities receive a lot of political autonomy under the new regimes. And this implies also a lot of jurisdictional conflicts, because you have different jurisdictions, federal, state, and community in many cases, and regulations on the fisheries that is a mess and is still taking shape in most cases, particularly in Brazil. You know, the resex, which started, as I mentioned before, in the Amazon, were implemented along the sea, along the coast of the country. There are now 20-something of what they call marine resex, or reservas extractivistas marinas. And they, fishermen there target a variety of resources. One of the most important is Caranguejo usa, is Usides cordatus, which is a big cousin of the yucca crabs that many people are familiar with, but these are big. And you see this guy, this is a caranguejeiro. They have this hook, it's all soaked in mud. They will go in the mangrove swamps, and the crabs will make a gallery that is about 1 meter deep. They will introduce a hand. If the hand is not enough, they will use this hook to get the crabs out of there, tie them in packages, and sold them in villages. And you see this crab in all big cities of Brazil. It's a very popular consumption item, fairly expensive, but fishermen are really very poor. The lowest tier of society in the places where they operate, or of fishing communities. And it's a huge fishery. Involves, there are 9 marine resex in the state of Pará, contiguous marine resex. They provide for the subsistence, at least for the partial subsistence, of something like 150,000 families, that fishery. And this is an interesting number, an interesting comparison. You remember that I mentioned that we have only one industrial fishery here in all the benthic fisheries that you review in Latin America. That fishery involves, for approximately, just rough numbers, for each person employed by that industrial fishery of Argentina, the one with the 4 big vessels, 2 Canadian, 2 American, for each person employed, or that gets his livelihood from that fishery, there's about 1,000 people getting their livelihoods from all the other fisheries that we are considering combined. Yet that industrial fishery, the output in terms of money, is approximately equivalent or even larger than all the other fisheries combined. And this is an interesting contrast, because you see the industrial fisheries can be economically very significant, and significant for the economy of the country. They pay taxes and they mobilize but from a social perspective, in this, when we make this comparison, these small scale fisheries can be incredibly significant. And they have been ignored for a long time. So, lots of conflicts. There are no 2 resex that are equal to each other. They are all different. This is an evolving system, and a phenomenal opportunity. Is a living lab for people interested in management systems. And finally, the last one of these cases of restitution of rights to communities. This is in the Afro-Colombian communities of the Pacific of Colombia, especially the state of Nariño. There's about in the order of 30,000 women that will gather this clam, piangua, which is called pata de mula in Mexico, also anadara, and mostly exported to Ecuador, but is the basis of the livelihood of thousands of households in the region. Now, here the government of Colombia gave back authority to those communities, about 150-something communities back in the 1990s. But the main problem they have these days is violence, of course, because of all the mangrove swamps where these women are harvesting for piangua. They are on the way between the highlands of the country and the coast, and so the whole region is affected by all the violence that you read about in the newspapers, the armed forces, the paramilitary, the narcos, and the guerrilla, and they tell you that they don't know exactly who is coming when you see armed people, but it's a whole mess. So you see all sorts of external threats to this. So those were the cases, some of the cases that we have been looking into. Now, there's a number of transversal issues that is interesting to, do we still have time? Sure. Okay, there's a number of transversal issues that is interesting to go over, and in this cross-case comparison, and these pertain to the origins and objectives of the rights systems, the levels of devolution of authority, the incentives for resource conservation and stewardship, the issues of economic sustainability, social sustainability, provision of scientific and technical support, and issues of enforcement and compliance. And I'm not going to go over all that, but those are the main axes of the conclusions that we were trying to derive from this exercise. In terms of the objectives of the privilege rights-based systems, there are some basic big families of objectives that generally match some families of values that society will attend to. And the first one is biological sustainability, and concerns about biological sustainability were usually motivated by overfishing. And we saw through the cases that I was talking to you about, you saw several overfishing crises. And so also it's a concern in the case of biological sustainability in the case of new or developing little known fisheries. So that's one big families of one of the main family of motivation for the implementation of this kind of systems. The second one is social equity for access opportunity, which is, as I mentioned before, typical of informal systems, and particularly of those cases where you have individual access to fishing spots. The third one is conservation, biodiversity and ecological integrity. And this is built into the objectives only in the case of Brazilian resex. And the case of Brazilian resex, they have a dual mandate. They are, by definition, they should attend both to ecological integrity and to social integrity and cultural integrity, which brings a number of problems in the process of implementation. Now, the notion of ecological integrity is also implicit in the case of Chile. Many people talk about these turfs in Chile as a kind of a marine protected area, and there's some debate whether that is true or not, and to what extent they are, and what kind of protection do they give. And finally, the last one that we saw, the last two cases that we discussed, is the restitution of historical rights to indigenous peoples or traditional users. Now, in terms of the devolution of authority, there's virtually no devolution of authority in the case of in the cases where access privileges are vested on fishers or boats, in case of catch shares or license systems. But in those cases, there's a role for participatory ambits. So they don't have authority, but they usually can participate in some sort of committee or commission of participatory ambit, where you have around the same table fishermen and administrators and scientists sitting and discussing together. There is some devolution of authority in the case of the turf, for example, in the case of Chile, more significant in the case of Mexico, and there is significant devolution of authority in the case of restitution of historical rights to Aboriginal communities. I will skip the issue of social sustainability, but here, social sustainability refers to equity of access among either members of a catch share system, access of by organizations to territorial grants, or access among members of a community. And you have all sorts of... Now, one thing I want to touch on in a little bit more of detail is the provision of scientific and technical support. And there is a lot of variation here too. You know, many of those systems are very demanding or can be very demanding in terms of the support that they require, particularly when you have to estimate the quota or something like that. And you know, the support can be given directly to the fisheries authority, to some sort of advisory committee, or to fishers organizations. And there is a lot of interesting configurations here. In all cases here, the green spot here is the management agency, the state. The F is the fishers, and S is the scientific support. Who provides the scientific support for the process? And this is the traditional system, that the one that we start with in all cases. You have the management agency, the fishers, and some agency, an institute, a laboratory, something that will provide advice to the managers, and then the managers will enforce something on the fishermen, right? This is the typical topography or the typical architecture of the top-down systems with advice at the top. Now, there is a number of variation, and because of the color I lost some arrows there, but doesn't matter. In one case, in some cases, there is a displacement of the support from the top to the bottom. And this is the case that is advocated by Jeremy Prince. Some of you know him, an Australian that has been talking about the barefoot ecologies. 2007, we had this, remember Ima, and we had this whole meeting 1 week in what was it? In Aldan, about the notion of the barefoot. In the notion that when you have a number of fishing communities or networks of fishing communities, the most reasonable thing to have is to have people providing advice directly at the level of the fishing communities, and those barefoot ecologists should have some special kind of training to do that job. And you have here in Galicia a figure that has some things in common with the barefoot ecology, which is the technical advisors, right? Las asistencias técnicas, which are paid by the state, but they work a lot within the cofradías, and so to some extent they resemble this system. So you have some nominal advice at the top by a lab. You always are going to have that, but you have a lot of advice at the very bottom, and interaction between those barefoot ecologies and the fishing communities. Now, the case of Chile is very interesting because by law, fishing communities are required to hire a consultant, and a consultant can be a company, an individual consultant, a university, whatever, and pay for the services to get the baseline studies or the follow-up studies that they are required by the government to keep their privileges and to have an estimate of the quota that they are allowed to take every year from those small turtles. Now, paying for that is expensive, and many of the consultants are hired by fishermen, by the fisher organizations. They do not report back to the fishers. They report to the management agency. So it's a sort of a schizophrenic system, and many people think that this is that understand that there is much interaction between the consultants and the fishermen just because the fishermen have to participate in the process. And there really is that the fishermen really are mostly service providers and spectators in the process, but they are not really involved in the process as much as they could be. Now, I lost part of of the drawing there, but there were several alternatives that we have been discussing with the Chilean colleagues and agencies and fisher federations and so on, like, for example, coordinating different organizations, trying to move from this system of the consultant being higher at the bottom but reporting upwards to something that looks more closely to the barefoot ecologies, that, consultants that are more consubstantiated with the needs of the people and the participation of the people and so on. And there have been some more. Now, these are situations that are common in the case where you have territorial access privileges. In the cases where you have a catch shares, where you have where the fisher, there is no significant devolution of authority, but there is a significant demand for technical assistance, you tend to have, and this evolves recurrently again and again and again in many systems, some sort of technical committee, some sort of participatory ambit, as I was saying before, where you have participation in the decision making or in the advisory process of fishers, managers, and scientists. And you see this in the Galapagos Islands, in the San Jose Gulf, in Patagonia, in the sea urchin fishery in southern Chile. The people in Venezuela are thinking about something like that, in Mexico, in Baja California. So this tends to pop up as an alternative, so that you have some independent scientists that won't be reporting either to the fisher or to the agency, but really to that technical committee, which can be in turn part of a wider advisory board. So these are the different configurations that oh, look at that. They were hidden. Okay. So, a brief recap, some simple general lessons. The first one is that there are no simple rules. There are no general recipes. And this is very important. Back in 2004, we were at the biennial meeting of the International Association for the Study of Common Property that was created by the late Elinor Ostrom, who many of you know. He won the Nobel Prize in Economics just because of dealing with problems not very different from the one that we are discussing here. And she gave the keynote, she was the keynote speaker, and at one point she stopped and told the audience, there were many people there, something like 500 people, and told them, well, now you're going to repeat with me 3 times. And everybody had to repeat, there are no general recipes. There are no general recipes, because everybody, it's very common that when somebody gets enthusiastic about some idea, especially if he or she has some role in the concoction of the idea, they will tend to see that as a panacea. And we see lots of advisors in the international community, academic advisors, just trying to promote a single idea again and again and again obsessively. And we see a lot of that these days with territorial access privileges. We have a lot of merit, but do not fit. It's not a suit, a robe that will fit everybody. It will fit in some cases, they won't fit in others. The introduction of territorial use rights, the AMER system in some communities of algal gatherers in Chile was a complete disaster, for example. And so you have to be, and you have to, the first lesson is that you have to attend to all aspects of sustainability, to the biological, the social, the economical, the institutional, before you implement or advocate or try to move the system in some direction. And I painted here something where we see some progress, in my opinion, in green, and something where we don't see much progress in red. The second general lesson is that you should create always ambits for the interaction between stakeholders, between fishers, managers, scientists, environmentalists in many cases, usually NGOs. And this can take a number of different shapes, but they always contribute significantly in one way or another to the sustainability and the resilience of these systems. Now, the red thing is says promote transparent and effective support from the state regarding enforcement legislation and the courts. And that's where we are lagging behind in terms of the political will on the side of the state to accompany with the tempo that is required and the will that is required the processes of transformation that we are seeing in many of these fisheries. So we see a lot of success in many places, that things that we didn't see, you look at the same cases that I was talking about today, 30 years ago, and there was nothing resembling the mood of participation that you see these days. So there are things that are changing, but you still see the state, and that's because the state has its own tempo. It's slow to adjust, so the other two things is that there is a lot of in the case of the fisheries that we deal with, there is a lot of promise in many of the forms of territorial right allocation, and that the success of those territorial privileges will depend on a number of things that we should attend to, which is the level of fishers organization, the productivity of the territories that are granted as privileges, the enforceability of the boundaries of those territories, which is a very substantial issue in all cases, and the effective devolution of authority, with many the state often being very reluctant to devolve authority to the communities, and yet not being able to exercise the authority that they retain, for example, in terms of enforcement. And finally, in the process, and this is the last slide, in the process of implementing a new management system, you have several stages. One is when you go like in Venezuela, for example, if they want to, they say, well, we need to implement something here, and we are going to see the same thing, or we are seeing the same thing in many other fisheries. We need to do something. We need to implement the system. First thing that you have to do is identify the relevant stakeholders and the meaningful values that are that are significant to society in that particular case. And poor identification of the stakeholders has been a great problem in some cases of institutional engineering, like the implementation of territorial use rights in Chile, for example, where because of no process of stakeholder identification at the beginning of the process, many people were left empty-handed, and that led to a significant social conflict in several parts of the country. So there's a whole family of methods here, what they call stakeholder analysis, right? That you need to know who is who in the system before you start giving privileges to some and inevitably not to others. So then you need to have a process of negotiation among the stakeholders, and this is where you need to create those participatory ambits I was talking about. You need to define the objectives according to the values that society will privilege. And you need to design policies to reach those objectives in the context of these participatory ambits. And then you need implementation, monitoring, and fundamentally feedback, which is something that many of these systems do not have built in. So this is the notion of these loops, right? You have to go again and again through that iteration, and usually there are two levels of looping that we tend to call the blue and the green loop, just because that's the way we painted them the first time. So you have a green loop, which is the every year to year process of assessing and getting together, and for example setting a quota or whatever other measure that and the other one, which is review of the entire system every so many years. But you need to have feedback in the two levels, in the year-to-year and in the long-term adjustment of the process. So these are not terrifically surprising findings, but I think that they are well supported, and that's what we have learned, or distilled from a number of experiences in recent years. Thank you very much. A wider range of options for the allocation of access, privileges, and rights. That means for creating the incentives for the behavior that society expects from the fishers. And this is particularly the case in what we call the S-fisheries. Now, what are the S-fisheries? Anna coined the term S-fishery for a family of fisheries that is very well characterized. And the name S-fishery comes from the numbers of times that the letter S appears in the diagnostic characteristics of it, so there's nothing magical about that. It's just convenient to have a shorthand, an easy term. So they tend to be small scale. They are all small scale, not tend to be. They are spatially structured. They target generally sedentary stocks because animals attached to the seabed. They are either sessile, like mussels and sponges and algae, or if they move, they don't move a lot in relative terms, as, for example, as related to the fishing process. That's the case of octopus and crab and lobsters and the like. And then they tend to target single species or a few species. So the S-fisheries are, as I was saying before, they are a very well-defined category. And that's strong. They have that strong spatial structure unfolds across a hierarchy of nested scales. And that hierarchy is the scaffolding of all the components of the social ecological systems of which these S-fisheries are part, in the dynamics and the structure of the resources, because these sedentary resources tend to have a lot of structure, and that structure is persistent in time. You tend to find a mussel bed where it has been in the past. That structure of the resource, it will give structure to the fishing process itself, so that the fishing process, for example, the pattern of effort allocation, effort intensity matches the distribution of the resource. To the geography of the fishing communities and social networks, because fishing communities in places like Chile or that we know well, the fishermen community tend to be located close to the fishing grounds, to the harvest strategies, and ultimately to the governance institutions. Now, the significance of that spatial dimension in the case of S-fisheries means that there is it opens the possibility of a high diversity of tenure arrangements. And why is that? The reason for that is that in this fishery you have an opportunity that you don't have in other fisheries, which is access or privileges that are based on territory, not on a quota, on an effort quota, on a catch quota, but on some form of territorial allocation. And there are many forms of territorial allocation, formal or informal, and that gives a lot of it's a very rich system in terms of. So one more thing that I wanted to mention, I mentioned before that they tend to target either single species or a few capture fisheries, and in the case in the understanding that the aligning the right incentives is fundamental for sustainability and for motivate the responsible behavior of the fishers and other stakeholders and actors of the system as well. So in the particular case of fishers, which we are interested in this case, those incentives usually take the form of tenure or access, rights, or privileges. And we are going to make here a small distinction. In much of the literature, those two words, rights and privileges, are used interchangeably. But we make a distinction in the sense that rights are fundamental. It's something that cannot be alienated from somebody, while privileges are are alienable and is something that is conferred or granted by society under special circumstances. So there's a difference in the strength of the ownership, quotation mark. Now, in the case of industrial fisheries that we tend to be familiar with, and it's the fisheries that basically on which the theory of fishery was built upon. Those privileges usually take the form of ITQs or something related to that. ITQs meaning individual transferable quotas. Everybody knows what that means, either from the press or from, in these days is a well-known, well-understood concept. Well, not understood, but well-known. And then there's a number of other, like individual vessel quotas and other individual quotas, and they can be transferable or non-transferable. So there is a whole family of arrangements. Now, all those systems, ITQs and related systems, they have several characteristics. They are administratively expensive in the implementation. They are demanding in terms of the stock assessment support that they require. And they require effective enforcement. All those things are very difficult to achieve in the case of small-scale fisheries. You can, in principle, think that they can, feasible in large industrial fisheries, but in the case of the small-scale fisheries spread in small villages along thousands of kilometers of coasts, it's a difficult proposition. So. Besides that, many of those systems like ITQs and so on, when they are implemented in small-scale fisheries, they tend to be, and they have been in many occasions, highly disruptive. Because when you implement one of those systems, somebody is left inside, somebody is left outside. Somebody will wake up in the morning with a lot of asset in his pocket because he got a quota, and somebody will be left empty-handed. And in the socially tightly knit communities we tend to work with, this can be really disruptive. So, in the case of small-scale fisheries, we need to consider the lecture today, the presentation today deals with the issue of rights and tenure in fisheries targeting seabed resources. Seabed resources meaning everything that is attached to the seabed. Invertebrates, our mariscos or shellfish, but also algae, corals, sponges, everything that is attached to the seabed. And we are going to review several cases from Latin America and try to derive some general lessons from comparison, and basically is learning from experience. What have we learned from a number of cases we have been involved with. The presentation today is part of the results of a project on tenure in Latin American fisheries. Has two components: one on shellfish or benthic resources, and the other on finfish resources. I coordinated the benthic stuff, and my colleague Juan Carlos Seijo from Yucatan, Mexico, from Merida, he coordinated the counterpart, the finfish study cases. And this is part of a project from FAO called Guidelines on the Responsible Governance of Tenure of Land, Fisheries, and Forests. And is oriented ultimately to develop some code of conduct for the governance of those resources. And of course, our work is support for the fisheries component. The focus of this presentation is on incentives. And you know that there is over the recent years, there has been a lot of emphasis on the significance of incentives for sustainable and resilient management of world